the Cook. A historical fiction of love, identity and fate by S.J. Jeppsson. Chapter 1. The Warmth of Dough and Dreams. Titchfield, England. March 1912. The scent of fresh bread filled the bakery kitchen, warm, rich, and curling through the beams like a comforting embrace. Outside, the cobbled streets of Titchfield bustled with the quiet rhythm of a morning market, the sound of barrows creaking under the weight of apples and sacks of flour, of fishmongers calling out their latest catch to the early risers. Their voices carried through the crisp morning air, boasting of fresh herring, mackerel, and Dover sole, hauled in from the docks of Portsmouth just 5 miles away, an easy half-hour's journey for the finest seafood in Hampshire. Inside, 18-year-old Katherine Cooke pressed the heel of her hand into the dough, rolling it against the wooden counter with practiced ease. Her father's steady instructions echoed in her memory, a reminder of the years spent at his side in this very bakery. "The dough will tell you when it's ready, Katie," her father had always said, his voice rough with years of work, softened only by his love for his craft. "Listen with your hands." Kate had listened. She had learned. Baking was in her blood. It had been in her mother's too. Nanny Warren Cooke had been the heart of this bakery long before Kate could even walk. It was her family's trade, her craft, and when she had married William, she had taught him everything she knew about flour, spice, and firelight. Together they had built Cooke's bakery from the ground up, turning it into something reliable, cherished, something lasting. In those early years, when the flour dust still clung to their sleeves like a promise of what was to come, they had saved every spare penny to buy something special, a Kodak Brownie camera. It had seemed like an extravagance, but Nanny had insisted. They would build a family here, she had said, filling their home with children and laughter, and she wanted to capture it all, their life, their love, their legacy. The first photographs had been simple. Nanny and William standing proudly in front of the bakery, hands dusted in flour, grinning at their hard-earned dream. Then came the ones of Kate as a baby, bundled in her mother's arms, her tiny fingers curled around Nanny's apron. Over the years, there were more. Kate, at 1 year old, sitting on the counter, wide-eyed as her mother kneaded dough. Kate, at 2, grasping a wooden spoon far too big for her hands, her mother laughing at her determination. But then, the pictures stopped. Tragically, Nanny had died in childbirth when Kate was just 8 years old. The silence after her passing had been colder than any winter, pressing against the walls of their home like a heavy fog. Her father had never spoken of those days, of the grief that had shaped him, but he had kept baking. He had thrown himself into kneading and shaping, rising before dawn every morning and working until long after sunset, as though keeping the ovens warm could somehow keep her memory alive. Kate had done the same. By the time she was 12, she could shape a perfect loaf without thinking, measure ingredients by feel rather than by scale. She had memorized every recipe her mother had ever made, especially the one that made Cooke's bakery beloved, even as far as Portsmouth. Nanny's famous meat pies. Even now, sailors docking at Portsmouth's busy port sent orders ahead to bring them back home. Flaky, golden pastry filled with rich, savoury gravy and seasoned meat, warm with pepper and thyme. They were the bakery's pride, and they were her mother's legacy. There were still photographs tucked away in a wooden box beside her father's bed. The ones with Nanny had faded at the edges, but Kate knew them by heart. And then there were the later ones, just her and William, side by side at the bakery, flour on their faces, hands busy shaping the dough that had carried them through their grief. But 3 special photographs had a place of honour. They sat in simple, unmatched wooden frames next to the till on the counter, where customers placed their coins and picked up their warm loaves. One was of William and Nanny, taken in the early days of the bakery, their smiles bright and full of promise. The second was the only picture of all three of them together. Kate, no more than 2 years old, held between the two of them. And the third was of Kate alone, taken just after her 16th birthday. She stood outside the bakery in her apron, her hair tied back, flour dusting her hands. 3 photographs, a family's history captured in just a handful of images. After Nanny's death, the need for her help grew, and when Kate turned 15, she left the village school for good to work alongside her father full-time. She remembered walking home from school one spring afternoon, arms linked with her 2 closest friends, Lottie Wells and Mary Shepherd, the 3 of them weaving through the cobbled lanes like a braid of giggles and wild dreams. "When I grow up," Lottie had declared, "I'm going to Paris and marry a French duke." "I want a manor house with velvet curtains," Mary chimed in, "and a pony, or 2. "You'll need 3 for a proper carriage," Kate had said with mock seriousness, though she'd grinned the whole way. Back then, the dreams had been silly things, stitched together with ribbons and romance novels. But in the quiet years that followed, and Lottie had married a chimney sweep from Fareham, the dreams had stayed with Kate, not in the same fairy tale shape, but as something truer. Mary had gone on to serve a well-to-do family from Winchester. Last autumn, after spending the end of summer in Cork, she came back across on a Cunard ship. On their way through Southampton, she made time to stop by the bakery, just long enough to see Kate and bring something to her. She arrived with a crinkled newspaper clipping tucked into her coin purse, her eyes bright with excitement as she pressed it into Kate's hands. "Look," she whispered, as if the secret were too grand for the air. It was a photograph, grainy but full of wonder, published in the Irish News, capturing the launch of a ship in Belfast, the Titanic. The article spoke of its eventual journey to Southampton, where final preparations would take place before its first voyage across the Atlantic. The image had stayed with Kate long after Mary had gone. The ship seemed impossibly vast, impossibly radiant, a palace afloat. Since that day, she'd often found herself drifting into the dream of it, standing on its deck, chin lifted to the wind, reaching for something far beyond the soot-streaked rooftops of Titchfield. She hadn't needed a duke or a manor, just the feeling of forward motion, the promise of becoming someone else, or at least someone more. Titchfield was all Kate had ever known. Its quiet streets, the familiar faces, the gentle, predictable routine of the bakery. It was comforting, but it was also small. She had never travelled beyond Hampshire, never seen the great cities or felt the ocean breeze from anywhere other than the narrow, misty shorelines of Portsmouth. She wanted more. She wanted to stand beneath towering buildings, hear the voices of people from across the world, taste food she'd never even imagined. She wanted to go somewhere new. She just never thought she'd have the chance. Kate paused, her hands resting still against the dough as she stared out the flour-dusted window. A soft sigh escaped her lips, the kind that carried equal parts longing and resignation. The streets of Titchfield were the same as they had always been. A burst of laughter from outside broke her focus. She looked up, pushing a stray curl of her chestnut hair from her cheek, and caught sight of Charlie Whitlow, the bakery's apprentice, leaning against the window. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, flour dusting his dark trousers, evidence of the morning's work. "You daydreaming again, Kate?" he teased, grinning. "That bread won't knead itself." Kate huffed, rolling her warm dark brown eyes, but smiling all the same. "Unlike you, Charlie, I don't spend half my time gossiping with the market girls." Charlie laughed, shaking his head as he lifted a sack of flour onto his shoulder. "Well, someone has to keep them entertained." Kate rolled her eyes, but the smile lingered, the warm rhythm of the morning settling in, dough rising, the scent of cinnamon thick in the air. A short while later, the bell above the bakery door chimed. A tall, distinguished man in a finely tailored coat had stepped inside, brushing the lingering mist from his sleeves. Kate immediately recognized him. Mr. Walter Ashford, the headmaster of Boundary Oak Academy. Mr. Ashford had always carried himself with an air of quiet authority, his sharp eyes missing nothing. The last time Kate had seen him was years ago, when her father had briefly entertained the idea of sending her to the academy as a day student, before deciding she was needed more at home. William's face broke into a genuine smile as he stepped forward, extending a flour-dusted hand. "Walter Ashford! What brings you back to Titchfield, you old fox?" Ashford chuckled, shaking his friend's hand warmly before removing his hat and setting it aside. "Business, William, though it's good to see you still covered in flour. Some things never change." "You know me," William said with a grin, leading him toward the long wooden counter. "I was married into this bakery, and I've been dusted in flour ever since. Come on, sit. We'll put the kettle on." Kate wiped her hands on her apron and turned toward their guest. "It's good to see you again, Mr. Ashford." "And you, Miss Cooke?" Ashford gave her an assessing glance, his sharp eyes softened with something almost approving. "You've grown into a fine young woman." "Thank you, Mr. Ashford," Kate smiled. "That's kind of you." William busied himself at the small stove, setting the kettle to boil as Kate brought down the cups from the shelf. She smiled politely, arranging the cups on a tray. "Would you like milk and sugar?" Ashford gave a nod. "Just a splash of milk, no sugar." The kettle began to whistle and William poured the hot water while Kate prepared the cups with practiced ease. A moment later, she poured the tea and placed the 2 steaming cups before the men. Ashford took a sip, sighing appreciatively. "Still the best tea in Hampshire, I swear." William chuckled. "Only because it's served with fresh bread." They sat in comfortable conversation, reminiscing over old childhood adventures, of sneaking into the apple orchards, of being chased by the old miller, of the days before responsibility and the weight of adulthood settled upon their shoulders. Kate listened quietly, fascinated by the pieces of her father's youth that she had never known. And then, after a long sip of tea, Ashford placed a letter on the counter. Kate's heart skipped a beat. The seal was unmistakable, the Weatherby crest, pressed into the deep red wax. William's smile faltered slightly, his fingers tapping the wooden surface. "What's this, then?" Ashford leaned forward, folding his hands over the counter. "An opportunity." Kate swallowed, unsure why a sudden chill had crept over her skin. Ashford met her father's gaze, his voice calm, measured. "William, I came here today because I believe Kate would be a perfect candidate to serve as Miss Lydia Weatherby's ladies' companion on her journey to America." Kate blinked, surprised. Her father, however, merely raised a brow, waiting for him to continue. Ashford tapped the letter. "Lydia has been finishing her education at Boundary Oak these past few years, and as her headmaster, I was contacted by her family to help arrange for a suitable companion to escort her home. She'll be sailing aboard the Titanic. I recommended Kate." A stunned silence settled between them. Kate's mouth parted slightly, her pulse quickening. William stiffened, his fingers curling around the handle of his teacup. "You think my daughter, an 18-year-old girl with no formal experience, should accompany Lydia Weatherby across the Atlantic?" Ashford nodded. "Kate is intelligent, poised, far more capable than most girls twice her station. She was raised well, William. She carries herself with grace, and she knows how to navigate both the working class and the gentry." He glanced at Kate, his expression unreadable. She would do well in Lydia's company. Ashford tapped the letter once more, his expression thoughtful. "When the Weatherbys asked me to recommend a suitable companion, I knew I had to choose wisely. Lydia Weatherby is not merely travelling. She is returning to America to become the future Lady Hollingsworth. It was imperative that she be accompanied by someone who would reflect well upon her." William's brows furrowed. "And you think my daughter, a baker's daughter, fits that expectation?" "I do," Ashford said simply. "And if I may be frank, I'm not the only one." William stiffened slightly at that, his jaw tightening as he waited for him to continue. Ashford's gaze flicked to Kate, then back to William. You may not realise it, but your wife's name, God rest her soul, carries weight in certain circles. When I put forth Kate's name as a candidate, His Honourable Lord Hollingsworth himself approved. Kate's breath caught. Lord Hollingsworth? Ashford nodded. Reginald Hollingsworth, the father of the man Lydia is to marry. He took a measured sip of tea before explaining. Your mother, Miss Cooke, once served as a governess to the Hollingsworth family. She was entrusted with young Lord Hollingsworth's early education until he was sent away to school. Kate's mind reeled. She had known her mother had once been in service before marrying her father, but she had never imagined it had been in a household as grand as the Hollingsworth estate. William exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand along his jaw. She never spoke much about her time there, he admitted. Only that she was grateful for the experience, but even more grateful to leave it behind. Then he let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as he leaned back against the counter. Well, obviously, the life of luxury couldn't compare to the charms of a poor carpenter from Titchfield, he quipped. She had no choice but to marry me. Ashford chuckled, shaking his head. Yes, William, that must have been it. Kate felt a lump rise in her throat, a mix of amusement and something deeper, something bittersweet. Her father's words had been spoken in jest, but she could hear the truth in them. Nanny had left the Hollingsworth estate for love, for a simple life filled with flower-dusted mornings and warm hearths. A slow, knowing smile flickered across Ashford's lips. Yes, she chose to return home, but not without leaving a lasting impression. When I mentioned her name, Lord Hollingsworth remembered her instantly, and, by extension, was willing to trust your daughter with the well-being of his future daughter-in-law. Kate's mind whirled, her hands tightening around the folds of her apron, her mouth parted slightly, her pulse quickening. The Titanic. America. A chance to leave Titchfield, and a chance, perhaps, to step beyond the quiet, flower-dusted walls of Cook's Bakery and onto the path of something grander. And all of it, this opportunity, this impossible, glittering dream, had come because of a mother's quiet sacrifices, a past she had never boasted about, a life she had once left behind. William's fingers tapped lightly against the wooden counter, his expression thoughtful as he studied the letter Ashford had placed before him. This is all well and good, William said finally, rubbing his thumb over the flower dust still clinging to his palm. But what happens when she gets to New York? We aren't exactly a family of means. I don't want her stepping off that ship with no real plan. Ashford nodded, as if he had expected the question. The Weatherbys have assured me that Kate would be provided for, at least temporarily. But beyond that, he exhaled slowly, I imagine her options would be open. There are always opportunities for respectable young women in a city like New York. A good reference from the Weatherbys would serve her well. Kate hesitated before speaking. I'd rather not rely on that alone, she admitted. If there's a chance for me to gain experience while I'm aboard the ship, something that could help me find work when I arrive, then I'd like to take it. William's brows lifted slightly in surprise, but then his expression softened with pride. Ashford considered this, tapping a thoughtful finger against his chin. Actually, that may not be out of the question. It's not a common arrangement, but if I spoke with the right people at White Star, given your background, I suspect they would be happy to place you in one of the dining areas. Kate's pulse quickened with cautious excitement. You mean I could work in the second-class dining service? Possibly even first class, Ashford mused. With your skills, you might be assigned to assist in one of the finer dining areas, or even as a food steward. It wouldn't be strenuous, but it would give you experience and references that could serve you well in America. Perhaps you could work under a senior stewardess in the evenings, learning the trade, but still tending to Miss Weatherby when needed. William exhaled, shaking his head with quiet amusement. So, let me get this straight. My girl gets an opportunity to travel across the Atlantic, meet high society, and instead of just enjoying it, she wants to work. He shot Kate a teasing smirk. You've always been your mother's daughter. Kate grinned, nudging him playfully. I take that as a compliment. Ashford chuckled. It's a wise decision, Miss Cooke. It will prepare you for what's to come, while still allowing you to fulfill your duties to Miss Weatherby. Kate nodded firmly, a small spark of anticipation lighting in her chest. For the first time, the thought of leaving Titchfield felt real. She wasn't just being carried along by fate, she was choosing her own future. And that, more than anything, was what mattered. William hesitated. I don't know, Walter. Ashford set down his teacup, glanced at Kate, and rose from his chair. Let's step outside a moment. He picked up his hat and gave Kate a warm nod. Thank you for the tea, Miss Cooke. William followed, wiping his hands on his apron as they stepped out the front door into the soft hush of the village. The air was cool and misty, typical for March, clinging to Ashford's coat as the quiet hum of morning activity drifted through the fog. Ashford adjusted his hat against the damp. William, I understand your hesitation, but this is more than a job. It's an opportunity, a respectable position, a grand voyage, and a chance for Kate to see a different world. William glanced down the misty lane, fingers tapping absently against the wood of the doorway. She's only ever been here. And that's exactly why she should go, Ashford said gently. She's ready. I've watched her grow up, same as you. She has her mother's grace and your steadiness. She won't let you down. William sighed, folding his arms. You make a fine case, Walter, but I'll need time to think on it. Ashford gave a small nod, as if he'd expected nothing less. Of course. The ship departs in less than 2 weeks. I'll leave the letter with you. He placed the envelope gently in William's hand, then stepped down the mist-slicked steps toward the waiting carriage. With a final glance at the bakery's fogged windows, he climbed inside. The driver gave a low whistle, and the horses moved off at a steady pace, their hooves fading into the hush of the village street. That evening, Kate found her father sitting by the fire, his pipe unlit, the letter from Ashford resting beside him on the small table. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. Kate sat down across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. You haven't said what you think of all this, William finally said. Kate hesitated. I think it's the kind of opportunity that only comes once. William nodded slowly. And you want to go? She nodded. I do. I want to see the world, to do something beyond the bakery. I love it here, Papa. But this is something more. He studied her carefully. You sound just like your ma. A small smile tugged at Kate's lips. She always said the world was bigger than our little lane. William exhaled, a long breath through his nose. Then he reached over and tapped the folded letter beside him. I'll think on it, he said. We've got a few days. No need to rush a decision we can't take back. Kate nodded, a flicker of hope settling in her chest, soft, uncertain, but there all the same. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a pale light through the flour-dusted windows of the bakery when Kate padded downstairs, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. The scent of fresh bread clung to the air, warm and familiar. But this morning, something felt different. At the foot of the counter, where the fire still crackled gently in the hearth, sat a large, well-worn travelling trunk. The leather was faded and weathered at the corners, but the brass fittings still gleamed faintly, polished with care. Kate stopped short, her breath catching. William was at the stove, pretending to busy himself with the kettle, but his hands stilled when he heard her behind him. She took a step closer. Is that... He turned, eyes tired but warm. It's not brand new, he said with the smallest shrug, but it's solid. Should get you across the sea just fine. Kate stared at him. You mean? He nodded once, then crossed the room with quiet purpose. I didn't want to rush into it, but these past few days, I watched you. Her eyes were already shining. I saw the way you kept looking out that window, he said softly. The way your hands moved through the dough, like your mind was somewhere else. You weren't here, Katie. Not really. William paused, then reached into the deep pocket of his flour-dusted apron and drew out a small bundle wrapped in soft muslin. He held it for a moment before offering it to her, wordless. Kate took it gently, unfolding the cloth with care, her breath catching as a silver locket glinted in the morning light. It was oval-shaped, delicate, and well-worn, its filigree edges traced with a faded looping pattern of vines and flowers. Along the outer rim, barely visible unless turned just so, were her mother's tiny engraved initials. N.W.C. She opened it slowly. Inside, nestled beneath the glass, was a single miniature portrait, her mother and father on the day of their engagement. Her father looked impossibly young, his dark hair thick, his eyes full of mischief and pride. Her mother stood beside him in a pale blue dress, a soft smile on her lips, her hand resting lightly on his chest. They looked in love, uncomplicated, fearless, full of beginnings. Kate swallowed, blinking back tears. She wore it every day, William said quietly, even when she baked. Said it reminded her what she was working for. Kate turned the locket over in her palm. The back was smooth with age, but the inscription still held. For my dearest Nanny, my heart, my home, my forever. Love, William. She ran her thumb across the words, then looked up. Are you sure? She whispered. William nodded, clearing his throat. She'd want you to have it, to carry her with you. Kate curled her fingers around the locket and pressed it to her chest. I will, she said softly. I promise. She stepped into his arms, burying her face against his chest, breathing in the warm, steady scent of flour and hearth smoke. And then she pulled back, her voice trembling with emotion. I'll make you proud. William gave her a nod and a gruff little smile. You already have. A few days later, a sleek black carriage from Boundary Oak Academy rumbled down the cobbled lane, its polished brass lanterns glinting in the crisp morning light. The horses, well-groomed chestnuts, pawed at the ground as the driver pulled the reins, slowing to a stop in front of Cooke's bakery. The rhythmic clatter of hooves faded, replaced by the soft creak of leather as the footman dismounted, adjusting his gloves before reaching for the carriage door. Inside the bakery, the air was thick with the scent of rising dough, warm spice, and the faintest trace of wood smoke from the ovens. It was a scent Kate had known all her life, one that clung to her clothes, her hair, one that felt as much a part of her as her own name. As Kate walked through the morning quiet of the bakery for the last time before her journey, she paused beside the till, her fingers brushing the smooth wooden counter, worn from years of hands exchanging coins for warm bread and golden-crusted pies. The 3 framed photographs sat where they always had, a quiet presence amid the daily hustle and bustle. Her gaze settled on the one of her parents taken in the early days, Nanny and William standing side by side in front of the bakery, their aprons dusted with flour, their smiles bright with youth and promise. It had always been her favourite, a reminder of where it had all begun. Kate swallowed against the tightness in her throat as she reached out, fingers curling around the frame. It was small but sturdy, the wood smooth beneath her touch. Without a word, she lifted it from its place and cradled it for a moment, as if memorizing the familiar weight of it. It wasn't much to take with her, but it was enough. She slipped it into her worn satchel, then walked to the threshold of the bakery, her hands curled tightly around the worn edges of her travelling cloak. This was it, the moment she had dreamed of. William and Charlie had been outside the bakery, stacking sacks of flour and crates of fresh eggs, when Kate stepped into the doorway. The scent of warm bread drifted from inside, mingling with the crisp morning air. But for once, neither man seemed focused on their work. William, his hands still dusted with flour, turned at the sound of her footsteps. His usual easy smile faltered for the briefest moment before he covered it with a gruff exhale. Then he paused. Wait, just a minute. He disappeared inside and a moment later returned, cradling a fresh loaf wrapped in brown paper and tied with a bit of twine. It was still warm, the comforting scent rising softly from the package. Without a word, he pressed it into her hands, his touch lingering just slightly longer than necessary. "For the journey," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, though his blue eyes shone with quiet pride. Charlie gave her a lopsided grin, hoisting her single well-worn trunk onto the footman's waiting arms. "Don't forget about us when you're off in the grand city, Cooke," he teased, though there was something softer beneath his jest. Kate stepped into her father's arms, breathing in the warm, familiar scent of flour and soap and hearth fire. His embrace was solid, grounding, and for a fleeting moment, she let herself be 8 years old again, safe in the circle of her father's arms. "I love you, Papa. I love you too, my little Cooke." Then she exhaled deeply, steeling herself before stepping forward. The footman extended his gloved hand, helping her up into the plush interior of the carriage, the scent of polished wood and fine leather replacing the familiar aromas of home. As the carriage lurched forward, the village of Titchfield began to disappear behind her, the bakery's sign swinging gently in the morning breeze. Beyond the rolling green fields and towering oaks, Boundary Oak Academy loomed in the distance, a stately manor of red brick and ivy-clad walls, its grand windows glinting beneath the pale morning sun. And within its halls, Miss Lydia Weatherby awaited. Inside the carriage, Kate held the locket tight. She would never forget where she came from. And now she was crossing, not just an ocean, but into a life she had only dared to dream.